The first time Elowen saw the sunrise over Redstone Ridge, it had been a quiet morning, the kind that promised peace. But by the time the light gilded the treetops, a shadow cut across her small clearing, a shadow that belonged to a man whose anger could rival the sun itself. He rode hard, the hooves of his horse drumming against the dry earth like war drums. Dust spiraled into the morning air, catching in the rays of the rising sun, blinding her for a heartbeat. Then, at the edge of her newly cleared land, he stopped. His long black hair tumbled over his shoulders, adorned with beads and tribal jewelry that jingled softly with the movement. His muscular frame, bare to the midsection, radiated authority and danger. "How dare you build here?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness like a whip. "This land belongs to my people." Elowen's heart skipped, but she did not flinch. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the axe she had used to fell the stubborn oaks that morning. She had built the cabin plank by plank, each nail driven with the promise that she would survive no matter what. She straightened her shoulders and met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice calm, steady, though a thrill of fear ran through her chest. "This land spoke to me. I answer only to it." For a moment, he said nothing. The canyon around them seemed to hold its breath. Birds scattered from the nearby pines, wings beating frantically, startled by the tension. The wind stirred the dry leaves at their feet, whispering secrets of old fights and old blood. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the rocky ground. His eyes never left hers. "A woman alone?" He muttered, almost to himself, disbelief sharpening the edges of his voice. "You think you can claim this ridge without the strength of 100 men?" Elowen allowed a small, wry smile. "I have the strength I need, and I have no desire to fight anyone who respects the land as I do." She gestured to the cabin, freshly built but sturdy, its logs still smelling of pine sap and smoke. "I do not take from it. I only shelter in its embrace." He studied her, the hard set of her jaw, the fire in her amber-brown eyes. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen, defiant, fearless, yet strangely connected to the land in a way that demanded recognition. "Most women would run at the sight of me," he said finally, voice lower now, edged with curiosity instead of pure rage. "You are not most women." Elowen shrugged, letting the wind tousle her dark hair. "I am no one's idea of most women. And this ridge is no one's to claim, least of all those who do not respect it." The Apache warrior stepped closer, boots stirring dust and dry pine needles. His eyes flicked to the cabin door, then back to her. "Perhaps you have courage," he said, "but courage alone cannot protect you from what lies beyond this ridge." Her pulse quickened. Beyond the ridge lay threats she had yet to fully understand: wild animals, merciless weather, and men from the town who whispered of her audacity in building a cabin alone. But she would not allow fear to rule her. "I do not ask for protection," she said firmly, planting her axe in the dirt at her side. "I ask only to be left in peace." He regarded her silently, the muscles in his arms tense, the sunlight glinting off the feathers in his hair. Then, after a long pause, he nodded slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. The canyon seemed to exhale, the tension easing like the last note of a drumbeat fading into the distance. Elowen felt a flicker of triumph, quickly tempered by the knowledge that this confrontation was only the beginning. Redstone Ridge was wild and untamed, but it had chosen her. And if anyone Apache or townsfolk intended to challenge her claim, they would have to reckon not just with her resolve, but with the land itself. The warrior mounted again, his dark gaze lingering on her cabin. "This land will test you," he said, voice carrying over the ridge. "Survive, and perhaps we will speak again." Then he was gone, hooves kicking up clouds of dust that settled slowly over the cabin. Elowen wiped her palms on her trousers, the rough scent of pine sap filling her nostrils. Her heart still pounded, but a new fire kindled in her chest. She was not afraid. She had been warned, but she would not bow. The ridge had spoken, and she had answered. Elowen moved through the cabin she had built with the meticulous care of someone who had known only solitude for years. Each plank of wood smelled of pine sap and smoke, and the rough-hewn furniture she had fashioned herself bore the marks of labor and patience. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with warmth and a comforting amber glow. Outside, the wind whispered through the ridge, stirring dry leaves against the logs and carrying the scent of the distant river. Confrontation with the Apache warrior still lingered in her mind, a pulse of adrenaline she couldn't ignore. Shadowhawk, the name the townspeople whispered in fear, had left her ridge that morning with a nod, but the intensity in his gaze told her this was far from over. She knew the ridge had secrets he would not yet reveal, and perhaps neither would she. Elowen wrapped her hands around the mug of strong black coffee she had brewed, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. Her eyes wandered to the small spring she had discovered months ago, hidden in the cliffs above the cabin. It had been a lifeline when she first arrived, a quiet refuge where the water bubbled over smooth stones, untouched by anyone else. She often came here to think, to plan, and to remind herself why she had chosen this rugged, unforgiving land over the town that whispered behind her back. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Her pulse quickened. Instinctively, her hand went to the axe resting against the wall. But when she opened the door, it was him. Shadowhawk stood there, the early sun glinting off the beads and feathers in his long black hair. His bare chest gleamed with sweat from the climb up the ridge, and the sun highlighted the muscles honed by years of survival. "You return," she said evenly, trying to mask the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "I came to see if the ridge had claimed you or if you would falter," he said, voice low, almost thoughtful. "Few survive alone here," Elowen gestured toward the cabin. "I've survived every challenge so far. And I will survive the ones to come." He nodded once, his dark eyes scanning the cabin, the spring beyond, the stubborn trees she had cleared. Then, almost gently, he said, "This land is old. It remembers. There are places here that test even the strongest." Curiosity flickered in her chest. "And you know them all?" she asked. "I know many," he admitted, "but not all. Even I respect what this ridge hides." The morning passed with a fragile silence, broken only by the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, and the soft murmur of the spring. Elowen finally broke it. "Why do you watch me?" "If you wanted me gone, it would have been done already." Shadowhawk's gaze softened. "Because you do not simply occupy this land. You listen to it. You answer to it. That is rare, even among my people. Most would be afraid. Most would run." A wry smile tugged at her lips. "I am not most people," she said. He studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the spring. "Come, I will show you a place few know. It will tell you more than words can." Together they climbed the jagged cliffs, the wind tugging at their hair and clothing. Elowen's muscles burned, but she did not complain. When they reached the spring, hidden behind a veil of vines and stone, she felt the calm of the water seep into her bones. The crystal-clear pool reflected the sky, the ridge, and for a moment, the image of the warrior beside her. "This spring," he said, breaking the quiet, "is sacred. It has healed those who respect it, punished those who do not. You must remember it. Respect it. Learn from it." Elowen knelt at the edge of the water, cupping it in her hands, letting it wash over her fingers. "I will remember," she whispered. "And I will honor it as I honor the ridge." He nodded approvingly, then took a step back, letting her space return. "Good," he said. "There is more you will need to learn if you intend to survive here. But I see you have the heart for it." The sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the spring, the cliffs, and the cabin below. Elowen felt a mixture of awe and determination. The ridge had chosen her, and now, for the first time, someone else, someone formidable, someone untouchable, acknowledged her place on a dot as they descended. The wind whispered once more through the trees. But this time it carried not warning, but possibility. Elowen knew one thing with certainty. The ridge would test her. The Apache would watch, and she would not falter. The rumors spread through Redstone Ridge like wildfire. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the woman who had dared to build a cabin alone on the ridge and the muscular Apache warrior who had confronted her. Some whispered that she was cursed. Others claimed she was fearless. Children hid behind their mothers. Peeking from behind fences at the ridge where smoke from her chimney rose against the horizon. Elowen did not care for gossip. She had never sought approval, only survival. But that afternoon, a new presence entered her life, one that made even the whispers of the town seem quiet by comparison. Wyatt, a grizzled rancher with sun-baked skin and a dark, weathered hat pulled low over his eyes, arrived on the trail. His spurred boots crunched on the gravel as he approached her cabin, each step measured, cautious, yet commanding. He carried no gun, yet there was an unspoken authority in his posture, a quiet weight of experience. Elowen spotted him before he reached her. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the axe. She leaned against the cabin wall. But instead of fear, a flicker of curiosity ran through her chest. "You're the woman from the ridge," Wyatt said, voice low, gravelly. He studied her cabin and the smoke rising from the chimney. "They say you've got a warrior watching over you." Elowen's eyes narrowed, but she stood her ground. "A warrior visited me," she corrected, "but no one watches over me. I answer only to the land." Wyatt's gaze shifted, briefly meeting hers. He saw the fire in her amber-brown eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, and he smirked faintly. "Most women I've met wouldn't last a week up here," he said, tipping his head back. "Yet you built a cabin and survived the ridge's first test." Elowen allowed herself a small, wry smile. "I've had no choice but to survive. The ridge doesn't care if you're brave or weak. It only rewards those who respect it." He nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "I've seen stubborn people before," he said, "but none like you." A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and stirred the ridge's dry leaves. From the shadows of the cliffs above, Elowen's eyes flicked to a familiar figure, Shadowhawk, the Apache warrior. He observed silently, a powerful presence framed by sunlight and dust, muscles taut and gleaming in the warm light, tribal beads and feathers catching the glow. Elowen felt the tension ripple between them. Wyatt didn't notice the warrior at first, only catching sight of the wind-blown black hair and the faint gleam of jewelry. "You're not alone in this," he muttered, more to himself than her. Shadowhawk finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying over the ridge. "You are welcome to watch, stranger, but do not interfere. This land speaks for itself and for her." Wyatt raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "I interfere with nothing. I just know a woman who can hold her own when most men would falter." Elowen felt a ripple of amusement. Even in the presence of the warrior, she noticed the subtle respect in Wyatt's voice. The townsfolk may have whispered about fear and scandal, but here, in the wide-open air of the ridge, only courage and skill mattered. The three of them stood in quiet tension, the wind carrying dust and leaves, the ridge stretching into the horizon like an unclaimed kingdom. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself held its breath. Then Shadowhawk turned, as if a silent signal, and began moving toward the hidden spring further up the ridge. Elowen followed, with Wyatt trailing behind, curious, cautious, yet undeniably drawn to the bond she had forged with the land and the warrior Dot by the time they reached the spring. The golden light of late afternoon shimmered across the crystal-clear water. Elowen knelt at the edge, cupping the water in her hands once more, while Shadowhawk surveyed the surrounding cliffs, alert yet relaxed. Wyatt remained standing, watching both of them, realizing that this woman had earned something far greater than rumor or reputation. She had earned respect, earned it not through words, but through the strength to stand alone. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Elowen knew one truth with certainty. Redstone Ridge was no longer hers alone, but it had chosen her as its protector. And the presence of the warrior and the stranger would only deepen the story the ridge had begun to tell. The wind came suddenly that night, whipping through Redstone Ridge with the ferocity of a storm. Elowen was roused from sleep by the acrid smell of smoke curling into her cabin through the cracks in the log walls. Her heart raced as she threw on her cloak, grabbing her axe. Somewhere down the valley, flames licked at the edges of the trees, sending sparks swirling into the dark sky like angry fireflies. She ran toward the ridge's edge, boots pounding against loose rocks, her lungs burning from the cold night air. The fire had started far below, at the edge of the forest where the dry brush had been waiting for a spark. It raced with unnatural speed, fed by the wind and the parched land. Elowen's stomach churned as she imagined the destruction it could bring, not just to her cabin, but to the ridge she had come to love. A shadow appeared at the periphery of her vision. Before she could call out, a figure landed beside her with the quiet precision of someone born to move through the wilderness. Shadowhawk. His bare chest gleamed with sweat, muscles tensed like coiled springs, and the beads and feathers in his long black hair swayed with each motion. "You should not fight alone," he said, voice low but commanding, as he carried a bucket of water from the hidden spring down toward the flames. "I can't wait for anyone else," she replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "If the ridge burns, everything I've fought for dies with it." Together, they worked in silence. Mud from the nearby creek and water from the spring were thrown onto the hungry flames, the air thick with smoke and the scent of charred pine. Sparks hissed as they landed on their clothes and hair, and the heat singed their faces, turning their skin ruddy and raw. Elowen's arms ached with every swing of her axe, every heave of a bucket, but she would not falter. She could feel Shadowhawk beside her, steady, unyielding, a force she could rely on even in the chaos. As they fought, the fire began to rage toward a cluster of dry oak trees at the edge of the ridge. Shadowhawk shouted over the roar of the blaze, guiding Elowen to a safer path and signaling her where to throw water for maximum effect. Their movements became a synchronized dance, born of instinct and trust, each silently reading the other's intentions. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, the night stretching on in a haze of heat, smoke, and adrenaline. By dawn, the fire was finally contained, smoldering embers glowing like molten coals against the charred earth. The ridge had been scarred, some trees lost to the flames, but the cabin and hidden spring were safe. Elowen sank to the ground, chest heaving, soot streaked across her face. Shadowhawk stood beside her, his silhouette outlined by the first pale light of morning. Despite the exhaustion etched into his face, there was a hint of admiration in his dark eyes as he looked at her. "You did not falter," he said quietly. "Most would have turned back. You fought when fear whispered to run." Elowen wiped her hands on her trousers, breathing in the smoky, pine-laden air. "The ridge spoke to me," she replied. "It said I must fight. I would not ignore it." Shadowhawk's expression softened, though he did not smile. "Few can hear it," he admitted. "Fewer still can act when it speaks. You have learned much already." For the first time, Elowen felt a quiet sense of connection with him beyond mere respect. It was forged not in words, but in shared struggle, sweat, and the unrelenting heat of fire. The ridge had tested them both, and in surviving together, something unspoken had formed. A bond that could not easily be broken. As the sun rose higher, spilling golden light over the burned and scarred landscape, Elowen realized the truth. She was no longer simply a woman fighting to survive alone. She had an ally, fierce and unyielding, someone who understood the language of the ridge in a way few could. And together, they could face whatever trials the frontier still held in store. The ridge had burned, but it had not broken her. And in the smoldering light of dawn, Elowen knew one certainty: this was only the beginning. By morning, word of the wildfire had traveled through Redstone Ridge faster than any wind. Townsfolk gathered at the saloon and the main street, murmuring about the woman who had survived the blaze alone with a warrior by her side. Whispers of fear, admiration, and disbelief floated through the air, mingling with the scent of smoke still lingering on the ridge. The mayor, a tall man with a crooked grin, called a council meeting at the saloon. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor as townspeople crowded in, their eyes darting toward the door, waiting for her arrival. Some came with curiosity, others with open hostility, certain that a woman who dared challenge the norms of Redstone Ridge could not remain unpunished. Elowen stepped into the saloon, boots tapping firmly on the worn floorboards. She carried no weapons, no hidden defenses, only the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse than gossip and suspicion. Behind her, a subtle shadow followed, the unmistakable presence of Shadowhawk. His bare chest gleamed in the morning light streaming through the windows, beads and feathers in his hair catching the glow. The townsfolk instinctively stepped back, whispers turning to murmurs of fear and awe. The mayor rose, clearing his throat. "This woman," he began, his voice shaky despite his attempt at authority, "has built a cabin on land that has been deemed unsafe, and she has attracted unusual company. We call this council to demand that she leave." Elowen's amber-brown eyes swept the room, meeting the skeptical and fearful gazes of the townsfolk. She let the silence stretch, the crackling tension more powerful than any words. "This land belongs to no one," she said finally, her voice steady and unwavering. "I claim nothing but shelter and survival. But I will not bow to fear, prejudice, or whispers of who should or should not inhabit this ridge." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some gasped. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The mayor tried again. "You dare defy us, defy the order of Redstone Ridge?" "I defy nothing," she replied calmly. "I simply live where the land allows me to live. I answer only to the ridge itself." At that moment, Shadowhawk stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd with a silent warning. The room seemed to shrink under his presence, the air thick with tension. He did not raise a weapon nor threaten violence, but the townsfolk understood instinctively that he was not someone to be underestimated. "You speak well," he said, his deep voice resonating through the room. "But respect the land, or it will test you as it tests all who dwell upon it." A ripple of unease spread through the council. Even the mayor faltered, unsure how to respond to a warrior whose presence carried both authority and quiet menace. Elowen took a step closer to Shadowhawk, her voice firm and unwavering. "I do not seek to conquer this land. I seek only to live in harmony with it. And I will do so, regardless of fear or judgment." A tense silence followed. The townsfolk, used to dictating rules to women, were confronted with a force that refused to be controlled. It was not defiance alone that unnerved them, it was courage, calm in the face of threats, and the unspoken bond between woman and warrior that radiated strength. Finally, the mayor sank back into his chair, defeated by her unwavering stance. "This council will adjourn," he muttered, unable to meet her eyes. The room emptied slowly. leaving behind whispers and uneasy glances toward the ridge and the woman who refused to bend outside. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine, smoke, and freedom. Elowen and Shadowhawk stood together, the ridge stretching behind them like an unclaimed kingdom. The townspeople had tested her resolve, and she had passed not by intimidation, not by compliance, but by standing her ground. Elowen looked at the warrior beside her, his gaze steady, protective yet respectful. The fire, the confrontation, the council, they had all served a purpose. She now understood that survival was not only about fighting threats, but about commanding respect through courage and unwavering will. Redstone Ridge had chosen her, and anyone who sought to challenge her claim would soon learn that the land and the woman who listened to it were forces far greater than rumor, fear, or tradition. The ridge had been tested, and she had won. Days passed on Redstone Ridge with a rhythm dictated by the land itself, sunlight breaking over the cliffs, the wind carrying whispers through the pines, and the distant cry of hawks marking the passage of time. Elowen rose each morning before dawn, tending to her cabin, gathering water from the hidden spring, and checking the ridge for signs of danger. Shadowhawk moved alongside her, silently present, his muscles taut with every motion, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He had become more than a visitor. He was a teacher, a guide through the wildness she had chosen to call home. He showed her how to read the tracks of elk and deer, how to listen to the language of the wind through the trees, and how to anticipate the movements of predators that stalked the ridge. His patience was unyielding, yet his expectations were high. Every mistake was met with correction, not punishment, and every success with quiet acknowledgement. You must move with the land, not against it, he said one morning, his voice low and steady. The ridge tests all who dwell here. Those who fight it fail. Those who listen endure. Elowen nodded, her amber-brown eyes focused as she followed his lead. She had learned to move silently across the ridge, her boots barely making a sound on the rocky ground. She could sense danger before it arrived, hear the subtle differences in bird calls, and even detect changes in the wind that warned of approaching storms. Shadowhawk's presence beside her made her feel both vulnerable and protected, a strange duality she could not yet name. They paused at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley below. The morning light shimmered over the red rocks and pine-strewn slopes. Shadowhawk gestured to the distant herd of deer grazing quietly in the valley. "Observe," he said. "Notice their patterns, their instincts. Survival depends on understanding, not just strength." Elowen squatted low, watching as the deer moved with elegance, ears twitching, hooves light against the earth. She noted the way they communicated without sound, the way they responded to subtle shifts in the wind. "I see it," she said softly. "I understand what you mean. Strength alone cannot save me." He nodded approvingly. "Good. Remember this. Your mind must be as sharp as your body." In the afternoons, they practiced combat and self-defense. Shadowhawk taught her how to wield a knife efficiently, how to use the terrain to her advantage, and how to anticipate the movements of an opponent. Elowen's muscles ached in new ways, but with every swing, every dodge, she felt herself becoming more attuned to the ridge and to him. One evening, after a long day of training, they sat at the edge of the hidden spring, letting their feet dangle in the cool water. The sun set behind the cliffs, painting the sky in molten golds and deep purples. The ridge was quiet, save for the soft murmur of the spring and the distant call of a hawk returning to its nest. "You have changed," Shadowhawk said quietly, eyes fixed on the rippling water. "Not just in strength, but in presence. The ridge would have tested you, but now it watches with respect." Elowen smiled faintly, dipping her hands into the water. "And you?" she asked. "Has the ridge changed for you as well?" A rare, fleeting smile tugged at his lips. "Perhaps. You move with it in a way few can. That inspires caution and admiration, even in me." They sat in silence as the sky deepened to indigo, the stars emerging one by one above the ridge. The bond between them was no longer just survival. It was understanding, respect, and a quiet trust forged through shared danger and knowledge of the land. Elowen realized then that the ridge had chosen more than just a survivor. It had chosen a partnership, a delicate, powerful alliance between woman and warrior, each learning from the other, each strengthened by the presence of the other. The wind whispered through the trees once more, carrying the scent of pine, wildflowers, and distant smoke. Elowen knew, without doubt, that whatever the ridge had in store next, she would not face it alone. Shadowhawk would be there, and together they would endure. The bond was unspoken, yet unbreakable. And Redstone Ridge had never felt more alive. The wind had shifted, carrying the crisp scent of autumn across Redstone Ridge. Elowen stood at the edge of her cabin, the rising sun gilding the cliffside in gold and amber. The ridge was calm, deceptively peaceful, but she sensed the tension that always lurked beneath its beauty. Shadowhawk appeared beside her, as silent and imposing as the first day he had come to challenge her. His long black hair flowed over his shoulders, beads and feathers catching the light, muscles gleaming, ready for whatever the day might demand. "Trouble approaches," he said quietly, eyes narrowing toward the trail leading from town. Elowen's heart did not falter. She had learned to read the ridge as he had taught her. Every rustle, every distant sound was a warning. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice calm, steady. From the valley below, the townspeople appeared, led by the mayor and a small group of men. Some carried ropes, others brandished rifles, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. They had come to reclaim the ridge, to assert control over the woman who had defied them at the council. Elowen's amber-brown eyes swept the ridge, noting every vantage point, every rock and tree that could serve as cover or advantage. Shadowhawk mirrored her movements, alert and ready. "You will not take this land," she called down to the group, her voice carrying over the distance. "Redstone Ridge answers to no one but itself." The mayor stepped forward, trying to assert authority. "You have broken the laws of this town. You will leave or face consequences." Shadowhawk's presence shifted the atmosphere. His bare chest gleamed, muscles coiled like steel, his eyes dark and unwavering. The townsfolk instinctively hesitated, their confidence faltering under the aura of strength and command that radiated from him. Elowen took a deep breath and stepped forward, her hands empty but her resolve unshakable. "I have proven myself to the ridge," she said. "I have survived fire, storms, and threats from the town. The land has chosen me as its guardian. If you wish to challenge it, you will face me and the ridge itself." A tense silence followed, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, unexpectedly, a few townsfolk lowered their weapons, murmuring among themselves. The fire she had survived, the courage she had displayed, and the presence of Shadowhawk had changed their perception. Fear and respect intermingled in their eyes. The mayor, realizing the tide had turned, faltered. Perhaps this land is not ours to command," he muttered, stepping back. His pride wounded but his authority diminished. Elowen's gaze softened slightly. "It is not about power," she said, "but respect. Respect for the ridge, for the land, and for those who choose to live in harmony with it." Shadowhawk stepped forward beside her, his stance protective yet relaxed, an unspoken alliance between them. Together, they embodied the strength of the land and the power of those who listened to it. The townspeople slowly dispersed, leaving the ridge in silence once more. Elowen exhaled, a mixture of relief and triumph coursing through her veins. The ridge had tested her, and she had passed. The trials, the fire, the council, and the confrontation all had prepared her for this moment of vindication. Shadowhawk looked at her, a rare softness in his dark eyes. "You have endured much," he said, his voice quiet, almost intimate. "The Ridge is lucky to have you." Elowen met his gaze, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And I am lucky to have it in you." Together they walked along the ridge, the sun climbing higher, illuminating the cabin, the hidden spring, and the wide expanse of Redstone Ridge that now lay firmly in their care. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of renewal, of triumph, and of quiet peace. For the first time, Elowen allowed herself to feel the full weight of accomplishment. She was no longer a woman alone on the ridge. She was its guardian, its partner to a warrior who had become her equal, and its force against any who dared challenge it. The ridge had tested, threatened, and tried to break her. And she had stood. Redstone Ridge remained wild, untamed, and free, just as she was.